Philosophers have been called the watchdogs of reason. And while they use $3 words that most of us don't understand, they do mankind a great service. They hold intellectual assertions of men to the brutal standard of simple logic. If you look up the word logic in a dictionary, you'll read something like this: the study of the guiding principles of valid deductive reasoning as distinguished from invalid or irrational argumentation. It's a very simple yet very exacting standard. To boil it down, it simply means what you say is true makes some semblance of sense, that it is understandable, that it's free from logical, rational, linguistic, and definitional fallacies. It's just a simple standard that what you're asserting to be true is making sense, that it's balanced, coherent, understandable, reasonable, realistic, plausible. It must make sense. Or it's double speak. It's double talk. And philosophers hold our feet to the fire in that regard. While many Darwinists are highly educated, many seem to struggle with the rudimentary logic, rules of logic. I could have shared many quotes with you tonight from Darwinists with respect to origins, but I have picked one that will highlight the doublespeak that you hear quite often when a Darwinist is speaking about origins. I want to quote George Wald. He's a Nobel Prize-winning zoologist. Listen to what George has to say about spontaneous generation and all things and all other things, including complex life. Listen to what he says. One has to contemplate the magnitude of the task. The task is spontaneous generation. That 1 second there's nothing there, and then the very next second there's something there. There's no cause, just an effect. This is what he's talking about. So he says, one has to contemplate the magnitude of the task to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Now he gets that right. But listen to what he says. Yet, here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation. One has only to wait. Time itself performs the miracles. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. Anybody see a fallacy there? The possible probable and the probable virtually certain. This statement is logically nonsensical. It is unintelligible to anyone who just simply applies the rules, the very simple rules of logic. I want to say to you that with regard to the beginning, with regard to the origin, the very beginning of the cosmos, all macro-Darwinist quotes are like this. They all assert spontaneous generation. They all assert this. It is logically and rationally and physically impossible, but this is their assertion. It's astonishing that Darwinists get away with saying these kinds of things, but they do. Regarding George Wald's statement, I have a quote here from R.C. Sproul. I've used this quote before, but it's interesting that Sproul is actually responding to Wald's comment. Listen to R.C. Sproul here. What we have left then is pure magic. In fact, it's magic with a vengeance. It's a rabbit out of a hat, without a rabbit, without a hat, without a magician. Logically, that's what spontaneous generation comes down to. You remember Colin Patterson. He's the British Museum of Natural History senior paleontologist. Remember, he was the guy that said, I quoted him a couple of weeks ago, 9/10 of everything macro-Darwinists say is nonsense. Okay, now this guy knows what he's talking about. He's the British Museum Natural History senior paleontologist. He went on in a keynote address he gave in 1981 to the American Museum of Natural History. He went on to say this. This is a very candid admission. I want you to hear this scientist. He said, last year, I had a sudden realization that for over 20 years I was working on evolution in one way or another. One morning I woke up and it struck me. I've been working on this stuff for 20 years, and there was not one thing I know for certain about it. Senior paleontologist at the British Museum. Okay? This was quite a shock to me to learn that I could be so misled for so long. Subsequent to his epiphany, he set out to ask scientists and colleagues around him what they knew for sure. One thing you know for sure about Darwinism, macro-Darwinism, one thing. He says, inevitably, the silence follows. It occurred to me this week as I was studying that it truly staggers the mind that, one, I have to refute this. It's just illogical, irrational, it's unsubstantiated, it's an unproven proposition. But what really staggers my mind is it has become the unquestioned scientific orthodoxy of the day. And it takes a middle school philosopher, just an average student of logic can simply blow away their presupposition with respect to spontaneous generation. Listen to PhD mathematician David Berlinski. I love this quote. Listen to this. Macro-Darwinian evolutionary theory is really no more than a 19th century collection of anecdotes, utterly unlike anything we see in the serious sciences. It's a mess. It's a room full of smoke. It has no substance. It's not clear enough to be coherent. It's not supported by credible evidence. In fact, it's preposterous. I love to give you these quotes of scientists saying these things. I don't want you to take my word for it. Because I think many of you think, well, Jim has an agenda. You know, they hear a preacher talk like this, and they say, well, Jim's got an agenda. He's just got a biblical agenda. Well, of course I have a biblical agenda. So this is why I'm quoting men from the scientific community. I'm going to give you one more quote, and I'll move on. Molecular biologist, PhD, Jonathan Wells. I shared this with you before, but I want to share it with you again because I think most of us in this room will experience this in our lifetime. I believe this will happen in our lifetime. Listen to what he says. My conclusion is the case for Darwinian evolution is bankrupt. The evidence for Darwinianism is not only grossly inadequate, it is systematically distorted. I am confident that sometime in the near future, not too distant future, maybe 20 or 30 years, people will look back in amazement at how anyone could have ever believed it. Darwinism is merely materialistic philosophy masquerading as science, and people are beginning to recognize it for what it is. I'm going to say it again. I've told you, this is I think our 5th sermon in this series. I've told you 5 times. I'm going to tell you probably 2 more times. We'll probably have 2 more sermons in this series. We are Bible-believing Christians. We should simply trust our Father's Word. To say evolution, to try to say that you can read evolution into Genesis chapter 1, it does violence to the text. There's no textual reason to say there are long ages of evolutionary progress in there. You have to import that in there. It's not in the text. You say, well, Jim, they're a theistic evolutionist. I know they're wrong. You cannot get long ages of evolutionary process out of the text. You have to import it in there, and I would say to you it does violence to the meaning of the text. So what I want to say to you again, we must not import macro-Darwinian evolutionary theory into Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 to maintain our intellectual integrity. The opposite is true. We must reject macro-Darwinian evolutionary theory to maintain our intellectual integrity. That is not a theological statement. That is a scholarly statement. That is a scientific statement. That is an intellectual statement. And I don't ever want you to forget that. That's, the way one of the best ways to teach is repetition. I'm just going to keep saying that to you. This is not merely a theological proposition. It's an intellectual proposition. It's a scientific assertion, not merely a theological one. Some of you will say to me, you might protest and say, well, Jim, the Catholics and some liberal Protestants have in fact accepted evolutionary theory and they inject it into Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. My reply to you would be that fact reveals that they are not only unbiblical in their theology, they are uncritical in their science. So let's look at the text again. Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, 14 to 19. You heard me read the text. I'll just read it again. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. And He made the stars also. And God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from